The bitter December wind cut through London's narrow streets like a blade, and Margaret Thornfield pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried along the cobblestones. Behind her, her 3 children struggled to keep pace. 10-year-old Thomas with his serious brown eyes and protective stance, 8-year-old Charlotte clutching her younger brother's hand, and little William, barely 5 years old, whose small face was pinched with cold and hunger. It had been 6 months since the fever had claimed her beloved husband, James, and with him, their modest but comfortable life. The landlord had shown no mercy despite her pleas, turning them out into the streets when she could no longer pay the rent. Now, with winter's grip tightening around the city, Margaret faced the terrifying reality that she might not be able to keep her children safe much longer. "Mama, I'm hungry," William whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. His stomach had been empty for 2 days now, save for the thin gruel they'd been given at the parish house, barely enough to keep a sparrow alive. "I know." "My darling," Margaret replied, her heart breaking at the exhaustion in her youngest child's voice. "We'll find something soon, I promise." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were lies. Her small savings had been exhausted weeks ago, and the few odd jobs she'd managed to find, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, mending torn garments, barely provided enough for a single meal, let alone 4 hungry mouths. They had taken shelter the previous night in the doorway of an abandoned shop, huddled together for warmth, while Margaret listened to the sound of her children's chattering teeth and tried to devise some plan for their survival. Thomas, mature beyond his years, had whispered suggestions about apprenticeships or perhaps finding work in the factories. But Margaret couldn't bear the thought of sending her children into those dangerous, soul-crushing places. "Look, Mama," Charlotte said suddenly, pointing toward the end of the street, where warm golden light spilled from the windows of grand houses. The fine ladies and gentlemen looked so warm. Indeed, through the tall windows of the elegant townhouses, Margaret could see families gathered around dining tables laden with food, their faces glowing in the light of crystal chandeliers. Children in fine clothes played with expensive toys, while their parents sipped wine from delicate glasses. It was a world that might as well have existed on the moon, for all the hope she had of reaching it. "Come away, Charlotte," she said gently, steering her daughter back toward the darker streets where people like them belonged. "We mustn't linger where we're not welcome." But as they walked, Margaret couldn't help but remember the life she'd once known. Her husband had been a clerk in a respectable firm, and while they'd never been wealthy, they'd had their own small house with a garden where the children could play. She had worn decent dresses and served proper meals on china plates that had belonged to her mother. That world seemed like a dream now, as distant and unreal as the fairy tales she used to read to her children before the harsh realities of poverty had consumed their lives. The afternoon brought fresh humiliation when she approached the kitchen door of a large house, hoping to exchange work for food. The cook, a stern-faced woman with flour-dusted hands, looked her up and down with undisguised contempt. "We don't give handouts to beggars," the woman declared, already moving to close the door. "Plenty of workhouses in this city if you can't provide for your own." The word workhouse sent a chill through Margaret that had nothing to do with the December cold. She had heard the stories, families torn apart, children separated from their mothers, the cruel conditions that broke spirits as surely as they broke bodies. She would rather face death in the streets than see her precious children disappear into those terrible institutions. "Please," Margaret said desperately, her pride finally crumbling under the weight of her children's need. "I'm not asking for charity. I'll work for whatever you can spare. Scrub your floors, wash your dishes, anything at all." The cook's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing something genuine in Margaret's desperation. But she shook her head regretfully. "I'm sorry, love, truly I am," she said, her voice gentler now. "But the master's given strict orders about not taking on any more staff. These are hard times for everyone." As the door closed with a final click, Margaret felt something inside her begin to break. She turned back to where her children waited. their trusting faces looking up at her with the absolute faith that somehow their mother would make everything right. But for the first time since James's death, she wondered if she had been lying to herself as much as to them. The sky was darkening toward evening when they found themselves in Grosvenor Square, one of London's most elegant addresses. Here, the houses rose like palaces, their windows blazing with warmth and light, their very stones seeming to radiate wealth and security. Margaret knew they shouldn't be here. The constables would move them along soon enough, but she was simply too exhausted to care. They huddled together on a bench near the centre of the square, and Margaret wrapped her arms around her children, trying to share what little warmth her body could provide. Thomas leaned against her shoulder with the resigned patience of a boy forced to grow up too quickly, while Charlotte and William pressed close on either side. "Tell us a story." "Mamma," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Like you used to do at bedtime." Margaret's throat tightened with unshed tears, but she managed to smile as she stroked her daughter's dark hair. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice soft and steady despite the chaos in her heart, "there lived a brave princess who faced great challenges but never gave up hope, because she knew that somewhere in the world there was a magic that could change everything if only she believed strongly enough." As her voice wove the familiar words of comfort, Margaret gazed up at the stars barely visible through London's smoky haze, and wondered if miracles still existed in a world that seemed so determined to crush thee. Innocent and helpless, none of them noticed the tall figure who had emerged from the grandest house on the square, his greatcoat billowing behind him as he strode across the cobblestones with purposeful steps. None of them saw how his pace slowed, then stopped entirely as the sound of a mother's gentle voice telling stories to her children in the bitter cold reached his ears. But Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenscroft, saw them, a tableau of love and courage that struck him like a physical blow to the chest. And in that moment, something that had been sleeping in his heart for far too long began to stir with the promise of redemption. The Duke of Ravenscroft had been preparing to enter his carriage for an evening at his club, when the sound of Margaret's voice drifted across the square. At first, he assumed it was merely another beggar family that his butler would soon discreetly move along. Such sights were unfortunately common in even the finest neighborhoods during these harsh economic times, but something in the quality of that voice, the gentle cadence of words spoken with such love and determination despite obvious desperation, made him pause at his carriage door. Against his better judgment, he found himself crossing the square to investigate. What he discovered stopped him in his tracks. The woman was clearly a lady who had fallen on desperate times. Her posture, her manner of speaking, even the careful way she held herself, spoke of breeding and education. Her dress, though patched and worn, had once been of good quality, and her children, despite their obvious hunger and cold, displayed the manners of those who had been raised with care and attention. But it was the scene itself that truly captured his attention. A mother using her own body to shield her children from the bitter wind, spinning tales of hope and magic while they faced what might well be their last night of freedom before the workhouse claimed them. The eldest boy had positioned himself to block the worst of the wind from his younger siblings, while the little girl shared her small portion of bread with her baby brother without being asked. The Duke found himself remembering another cold night, many years ago, when he had been a boy of perhaps Thomas's age. His own mother had died when he was young, leaving him in the care of a father who viewed children as inconveniences to be managed by servants. On that long-ago evening, he had discovered one of the kitchen maids sitting by the servants' entrance, crying over a letter that had brought news of her family's eviction from their cottage. 8-year-old Adrian had given her his entire month's allowance without thinking twice, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, but had never forgotten. Now, nearly 30 years later, that same instinct stirred within him as he watched this brave family facing the darkness together. "Excuse me," he said gently. approaching close enough to speak without startling them. His voice carried the cultured tones of the highest society, but he deliberately softened it to something less intimidating. "I couldn't help but notice that you and your children seem to be in some distress." Margaret's head snapped up, her protective instincts immediately alert. She had learned to be wary of gentlemen who approached women in vulnerable situations, especially at night in deserted squares. But something in this man's manner, the genuine concern in his deep blue eyes, the respectful distance he maintained, made her pause before gathering her children and fleeing. "We're quite all right, sir," she said carefully, though her voice shook slightly with cold and exhaustion. "We were just resting before continuing on our way." The Duke's experienced eye took in the signs she was trying to hide, the children's hollow cheeks, the way little William swayed on his feet from hunger, the patches on their clothing that spoke of months of making do with less and less. More telling still was the quiet desperation in the woman's eyes, the look of someone who had reached the very end of her resources but refused to surrender her dignity. "Forgive me," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that clearly surprised her. "I am Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenscroft. I live just there." He indicated the magnificent house across the square. "And I couldn't help but notice that you seem to have been traveling for some time." At the mention of his title, Margaret's eyes widened slightly. She attempted an awkward curtsy despite being seated, clearly uncertain of the proper protocol for such an unusual situation. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. We didn't mean to disturb. We'll move along immediately if we're causing any trouble." "You're causing no trouble whatsoever," the Duke assured her quickly. "But I am concerned about these children being out in such bitter weather. When did they last have a proper meal?" The direct question clearly flustered Margaret, who glanced at her children's expectant faces before looking down at her hands. We had something earlier," she said unconvincingly. "Little William, with the innocent honesty of a 5-year-old, piped up before his mother could stop him. We had gruel yesterday. Mama, but my tummy still hurts from being so empty. And Charlotte gave me her bread this morning, even though she was hungry too." "William," Thomas hissed in embarrassment. But the damage was done. The Duke felt something twist in his chest at the child's simple statement. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by luxury, never giving a second thought to where his next meal would come from, or whether he would have a warm bed for the night. The idea that children, these well-mannered, clearly loved children, were starving in the shadow of his own abundantly provisioned home struck him as nothing short of unconscionable. "Mrs. he began, realizing he didn't know her name. "Thornfield," Margaret supplied quietly. "Margaret Thornfield. And these are my children, Thomas, Charlotte, and William." "Mrs. Thornfield," the Duke said with grave courtesy, "I have a proposition for you. My house is warm. My kitchens are well stocked, and I have more empty bedrooms than I know what to do with. Would you and your children do me the honor of accepting my hospitality, at least for tonight?" Margaret stared at him in shock. Dukes simply didn't invite impoverished widows and their children into their homes. It was unheard of, scandalous even. Yet something in his manner suggested he was entirely sincere. "Your Grace, that's incredibly generous," she stammered, "but I couldn't possibly—" "We're not. What would people say if—" "Mrs. Thornfield," the Duke interrupted gently, "at this moment I care far more about ensuring these children have a warm meal and a safe place to sleep than I do about what anyone might say. The weather is worsening, and I suspect you have nowhere else to go." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. They truly had nowhere else to go, no relatives who could take them in, no friends with room to spare, no resources left to secure even the most modest lodging. Her choices had narrowed to accepting his incredible offer or watching her children slowly weaken until the cold and hunger claimed them. "You don't know anything about us," she said desperately. "We could be. We might be. You are a mother doing everything in her power to protect her children," the Duke replied firmly. "That tells me everything I need to know about your character. The rest can wait until morning. Thomas, who had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone forced to grow up too quickly, stepped closer to his mother. "Mama," he whispered urgently. "William can barely stand, and Charlotte's been coughing all day. Maybe we should accept the gentleman's kindness," looking into her son's worried eyes. Then at Charlotte's pale face and William's exhausted slouch against her side, Margaret felt her last defences crumble. Her children's needs had to come before her pride. If you're truly certain, Your Grace," she said quietly, we would be most grateful for your kindness." The Duke's smile transformed his entire face, revealing a warmth that had been hidden beneath his aristocratic reserve. "Excellent," he said, extending his hand to help her rise. "My housekeeper will have rooms prepared immediately, and I'll have cook prepare something warm for the children. Come, let's get you all inside before this wind gets any worse." As they crossed the square toward the imposing front doors of Ravenscroft House, Margaret felt as though she were moving through a dream. The marble steps, the liveried servants who appeared to take their coats, the warm golden light that enveloped them like an embrace. It all seemed impossibly grand after months of cold doorways and hostile stares. But it was the Duke's continued kindness that truly amazed her. He personally ensured the children were settled in the kitchen with hot soup and fresh bread before they were shown to their rooms, and his genuine concern for their comfort was evident in every gesture. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and when we reach that milestone, we'll have an incredible surprise waiting for all our loyal viewers. Trust us, you won't want to miss what we have planned. Margaret woke the next morning in a bed so soft and warm that for a moment she wondered if she had died in the night and gone to heaven. Pale winter sunlight streamed through windows hung with silk curtains, and she could hear the distant sounds of her children's laughter, a sound that had been absent from their lives for far too long. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, followed by the entrance of a kindly woman in a housekeeper's dress who carried a tray of steaming tea and fresh pastries. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornfield," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, His Grace's housekeeper. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Margaret admitted, sitting up and accepting the tea gratefully. "But I should check on my children. Already seen to," Mrs. Patterson assured her. Little William slept through the night for the first time in weeks, according to young Thomas. "They're all in the nursery now, playing with some toys His Grace had me bring down from storage. When you're ready, His Grace would like to speak with you in his study." An hour later, Margaret found herself seated across from the Duke in a room lined with books from floor to ceiling. Morning light revealed details she had missed the night before, the genuine kindness in his eyes, the way his hands moved expressively when he spoke, the absence of any condescension in his manner despite the vast difference in their circumstances. "I hope you and your children were comfortable," he began, pouring tea from an elegant silver service. "Mrs. Patterson tells me the little ones seem much improved this morning." "Your Grace," Margaret said, setting down her teacup with shaking hands, "I cannot begin to express my gratitude for your kindness. But I must know what you expect in return. I have no money to repay you, and I couldn't bear for my children to suffer if there are conditions to your generosity that I haven't understood." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the windows. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old sorrow. "Mrs. Thornfield, may I ask what happened to your husband?" The question caught her off guard, but something in his tone made her want to answer honestly. "The fever took him 6 months ago," she said quietly. "James was a clerk at Hartwell and Associates, a good man who worked hard to provide for us. When he died, I discovered that most of what I thought were our savings had gone to pay for medicines and doctors during his illness. The landlord gave me 3 months to find the rent, but without James's income..." She trailed off, unable to continue. "And you had no family to turn to?" "James was an orphan, and my parents died when I was young." "There was no one else?" The stark loneliness of her words hung in the air between them. The Duke nodded slowly, as if her answer had confirmed something he'd already suspected. "I lost my parents when I was young as well," he said quietly. "And my wife died 3 years ago along with our unborn child. This house has been far too empty ever since." Margaret felt her breath catch at the raw pain in his voice. She began to understand why he had been so moved by their situation. He recognized the devastating loneliness of loss because he had lived it himself. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Your Grace," she whispered. "Thank you," he replied simply. "But I didn't invite you here to discuss old sorrows. I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Thornfield, one that I hope will benefit us both." Margaret's heart began to race. Here it comes, she thought, the true price of his kindness. This house needs what it has been missing for too long, the sound of children's laughter, the warmth of a family. Your children need education, security, and the chance to grow up without the shadow of poverty. "You, if I'm not mistaken, were once a governess yourself?" "Yes," Margaret said, surprised by his knowledge. "Before I married James, I worked for several fine families. But I don't understand what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting that you and your children make this house your home," the Duke said with quiet intensity. "You could oversee the household, ensure it runs as a proper family home should. The children would receive the finest education, tutors, music masters, whatever they need to prepare them for successful lives. And in exchange, you would give me something I thought I had lost forever, the chance to be part of a real family again." Margaret stared at him in shock. "Your Grace, you're talking about—" "But we're not your family. We're strangers who happen to cross your path, are we?" he asked softly. "I've seen how you protect your children, how they look to you with absolute trust and love. I've watched Thomas take responsibility beyond his years, seen Charlotte's generous heart, witnessed William's innocent joy despite all he's endured. These are the qualities that make a true family, Mrs. Thornfield, not blood or birth circumstances. The offer was beyond anything Margaret had dared to dream, but it also terrified her. What if she failed to live up to his expectations? What if her children somehow disappointed him, or the arrangement became awkward, or society's disapproval made him regret his generosity? "I need you to understand," the Duke continued as if reading her thoughts, "this is not charity. This house has been a museum of grief for too long. You would be doing me the favor, bringing it back to life, making it a home instead of merely a residence. Your children would have the same advantages as if they had been born to this life, and you would have the security and respect you deserve." "But what about propriety?" Margaret asked weakly. "What will people say about a duke taking in a poor widow and her children?" The Duke's expression grew firm, and she caught a glimpse of the steely determination that had built his family's fortune and influence. "Let me worry about society's opinions," he said. "Anyone who questions my choices regarding my own household will find themselves unwelcome in it. You and your children will be protected here. Mrs. Thornfield, protected and cherished as you deserve to be." Before Margaret could respond, the study door burst open, and William came running in, his face bright with excitement. "Mama! Mama!" he cried, throwing himself into her arms. "There's a room full of toys and books with pictures, and Mrs. Patterson says there might be ponies in the stable. Can we stay forever and ever?" Behind him, Thomas and Charlotte appeared in the doorway, their faces glowing with a happiness Margaret hadn't seen since before their father's death. "The Duke has been ever so kind." "Mama," Charlotte said, her eyes shining. "He showed us the library and said we could read any of the books we wanted. There are hundreds of them. And he said he'd teach me to ride properly," Thomas added, his usual serious expression replaced by genuine boyish enthusiasm. "And maybe I could learn about managing an estate, if I proved myself worthy of the education." Looking at her children's faces, faces that had been pinched with worry and hunger just days ago, now radiant with hope and joy, Margaret felt her last reservations crumble. "Your Grace," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "if you're truly certain about this arrangement, then yes. Yes, we would be honored to make our home here with you. The Duke's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Then welcome home, Mrs. Thornfield, he said, rising to embrace William, who had already decided that any adult who provided unlimited access to toys and ponies was clearly the finest person in the world. Welcome home, all of you, as Margaret watched her children chattering excitedly about their new rooms, their new books, and all the adventures that lay ahead. She felt something she had almost forgotten existed, hope for the future. The Duke of Ravenscroft had given them far more than shelter and security. He had given them back their dreams, and perhaps, in some small way, they had given him something precious in return, the chance to be part of a loving family once again, to fill the empty spaces in his grand house and his guarded heart with laughter and love. 6 months later, as Margaret stood at the window of what had truly become her home, watching the Duke teach Thomas to ride while Charlotte read stories to little William in the garden, she marveled at how completely their lives had transformed. They were no longer the desperate family who had huddled together on a cold bench in Grosvenor Square. They were home at last, surrounded by love, security, and the infinite possibilities that kindness had made real. Thank you so much for following this incredible journey of hope and transformation with us. If you've enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and when we do, we have an absolutely amazing surprise planned for our community, something that will take your breath away. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of story lovers. You won't want to miss what we have in store.